born on the 17th of April in the year 1885, and she was born in Rungstedland, Denmark. She was the second of Wilhelm and Ingeborg Denisen's 5 children. At the age of 10, her father sadly passed away due to grief and regret, and her maternal grandmother and her aunt Mary Bess homeschooled her until the age of 18, because the children of the wealthy family were homeschooled and were taught how to paint and also write stories. Now, she was taken to the Royal Copenhagen Academy at the age of 18, where she studied literature and arts. She then further pursued education in Rome, Italy, and Paris. At the age of 28, she accepted the marriage proposal of her half-cousin, Baron Bro von Blixen Museum. Reason being, she wanted the title of Baroness, which meant that she would become part of nobility and of royalty during that time. While the Baron, on the other hand, married Karen because she came from a very wealthy family. And so, when their marriage agreement was accepted, their mutual uncle, Count Morgan Friges, encouraged them to come to Africa to start a life for themselves, because he had come back from Kenya with enthusiastic tales. Now, because of the rumors of the First World War and because of the fluctuating economies, both the Denison and Blixen families came together and bought a 700-acre piece of land in Naivasha for the purpose of Baron and Karen to start a life for themselves. And so, in the same year, 1913, the Baron arrived in Kenya, Naivasha, with the aim of starting a cattle farm. But his good friend Lord Delamere instead convinced him that coffee growing would make him a millionaire instead of keeping cattle. And so, with the idea of making money faster, the Baron decides to sell the 700 acres of land and comes to Nairobi and buys 4,500 acres of land, where 600 acres was used for the growing of coffee. He named the land the Bagabi Estate, which was on the other side of the road, stretching backwards. And so, the next year, 1914, Karen arrived in Mombasa, Kenya, on the 13th of January and had a colorful wedding with the Baron on the next day. They then had their reception in Nairobi with the Country Club, and then had their honeymoon at the shores of Lake Naivasha. They then came and settled on their first house for 3 years, from 1914 to 1917. After 3 years, the Karen Coffee Company Limited was established, and 1,500 acres of land was again bought, which came together with a fully furnished stone house. Now, the house was built by a Swedish engineer by the name Ark Jogren. Ark Jogren was a Swedish and had come to Kenya in the year 1910, also with the aim of starting a coffee farm, but also his coffee farm had failed, and so he sold the 6,000 acres of land to Karen and the Baron. Now, Karen and Baron owned a total of 6,000 acres of land, and it was subdivided into 4 parts. The first one, 600 acres, was used for growing coffee. 1,000 acres was used by the natives who would live on Karen's farm. 2,000 was left as the grazing ground for the cattle, goats, oxen, and sheep and horses, while 2,400 was left as native forests. Now, because the Baron didn't do his homework, he thought that coffee farming will take 2 years to grow, but in reality it takes 4 to 5 years.
5 years.
And so
she was cheated.
Yeah. He didn't know about, he didn't research into it. And so when the Baron found out, he got bored of coffee farming because he wanted fast income. And so he would go on hunting safaris that will last as long as 7 months. And he will leave the matters of the farm to Karen to handle herself. Now, Karen grew lonely in the absence of the Baron and will visit the Muthaiga Country Club. During that time, women weren't allowed to enter the country club, but because Buckley Cole was good friends with Karen and was the owner of the country club, Karen could enter anytime she wanted. It was during one of these visits that she was introduced to Dennis Finch Hatton, who became very good friends with Karen and later on became her lover. So, because of the long distance between the Baron and Karen, their relationship grew sour, and the Baron moved out of the house in the year 1921, while Dennis moved into the house in the year 1922. Later on, their divorce was finalized in the year 1925, and they had nothing to do with each other. So, the 6,000 acres was left with Karen, because her supporters in Denmark were the ones providing the funds for buying the 6,000 acres of land, so it rightfully belonged to her, because her mother was also one of her supporters. Now, Karen faced a lot of challenges on the farm, such as the farm was too high for coffee growing. Coffee needs 2,000 to 4,000 feet for it to grow, while she was located 6,000 feet above the sea level. So the coffee used to get diseases because during the night it was very cold, and during the day it was very hot, because the weather changing, it affected the coffee. and she would produce 70 tons, and the lowest she produced was 40 tons, while other coffee growers on the right conditions would produce as much as 300 tons. So she wasn't getting enough income, and the profit was very low. And also her coffee factory had burnt down because her neighbors, the Maasai, used to burn down the grass during the dry season, and when the rain came, the new grass would grow and be nutritious for the cows. But the fire accidentally crossed the river and it burnt down Karen's coffee factory. Now, her supporters in Denmark then asked her to sell the farm, but she didn't want to sell because they had asked her to sell the farm because it was too expensive to rebuild it. So Karen tried different methods to save the farm, but all of them failed. Now, because the methods had failed, Karen is then forced to sell the farm. She sells the farm in the year 1931 to a large company in Nairobi known as Richardson and Martin. And before she leaves, Dennis Finch-Hatton dies in a plane crash. He was coming from Mombasa to Nairobi, and his plane had a malfunction on the propeller, and he died on the crash. He was then buried on the first ridge of the Ngong Hills, which were visible, on the other side.
It's not too far from here.
Not too far. If you go to the house, I'll show you where the Ngong Hills are located. You can see them from the house. It was the wish of Dennis and Karen to be buried on the Ngong Hills when they died. And since Dennis had died first, Karen buried him on the first ridge of the Ngong Hills and fulfilled his promise to him.
So his grave is visible.
Still on the Ngong
It's
Hills.
visible.
During that time it was visible, but because of the thicket, it's no longer visible. It was on the first ridge, the first hill we climbed. There's still a monument of Dennis's grave on the Ngong Hills. And so, because Karen had already buried Dennis on the first ridge, and Karen had settled her natives on a new land, which was the then Dagoretti Reserve. And then she had no option but to go back to Denmark. Now, when she went to Denmark, she became a writer. She published a total of 9 books, and her first book was known as The Seven Gothic Tales, which was published in the year 1934 under the pen name Isak Dinesen. Isak Dinesen was a male name in Denmark because the discrimination of women during that time was very high, and so she had to use a male name. She then published her second book, Out of Africa, which was also her most famous book in the year 1937, also under the pen name Isak Dinesen. Her last book was known as The Babette's Feast, which was published in the year 1963 by her family after she had died. It was the only book of Karen written under her real name because she had already gained fame and recognition in Denmark during that time. Karen died at the age of 77 in the year 1962 due to malnutrition. She had gained throat problems and also stomach problems, so she couldn't eat a lot, thus she died of malnutrition. Now, coming back to when she sold the land, the Richardson and Martin subdivided the land into housing estates, which is now the current estate that people live in. Then the house went under several tenants until the year 1963, when the Danish government bought the house and gifted it to the newly established Kenyan government as a gift, but with the condition that a college be built next to the house for women for science. And indeed, a college was built, and it was known as Karen College. Now, the then matron would use the house, and a pathway connecting the college to the house was built. And so, when the matron retired in the year 1980, a group of Danes living in Kenya approached the Kenyan government asking the house be turned into a museum. And the Kenyan government accepted the request, and the house was indeed turned into a museum, and it opened its doors in the year 1985, which marked 100 years from Karen's birth. Also in the year 1985 was when the movie Out of Africa was published and won the 7 Academy Awards and the Best Picture Awards. So that's the history of how the house became to a museum and how Karen lived in it. 2022 Foxon tractor, Model F. This was the tractor that Karen used while she was visiting the farm. It was made entirely out of steel to facilitate the movement of the tractor on the farm because the land was rocky and hard. The wheels also have metallic cleats that prevented dust from going to the driver of the tractor.
Zina rubber.
It was made out of steel because if it was made out of rubber, it would just puncture and it will need refixing all the time. We then have an ox cart that Karen used to transport her coffee from the farm to Nairobi railway station. Now the ox cart could be pulled by a minimum of 12 oxen and a maximum of 18 oxen. Now it could carry a total of 12 bags of coffee, which equated to a ton. And when the coffee was dried and harvested, they were loaded on the ox cart, transported to Nairobi railway station, which took a total of 6 hours. From Nairobi railway station, they'll be taken to Mombasa by train, which took a total of 3 days. And from Mombasa, they were shipped to London, which took a total of 6 months. Safe to use the system now. Here we have the farrow plows that Karen used to open up the new land when she was going to the farm. So she will take the farrow plows to the farm and it will open up the land and where coffee will be planted in. Karen had a total of 3 types of farrow plows. The first farrow plow was pulled by one ox, which is that one over there. This farrow plow over here was pulled by 6 oxen, and the farrow plow at the end over there was pulled by a total of 10 oxen. And the farm machinery, including the plows and the ox carts, were created by an Indian blacksmith by the name Puran Singh. He was the saddler, carpenter, and also blacksmith of the farm. We have the Ngong Hills. Ngong is our Maasai word meaning knuckles. We then have the Maasai Reserve, where the Maasai used to live and were Karen's neighbors. We have the Mbagathi River that separates the farm from the Maasai Reserve. We have the Mbagathi house atop over there in the corner, where Karen used to stay first for 3 years, and she later on moved into the Bugani house, which is this one over here, and it means surrounded by forest. Now we have the coffee factory that had burned from the fire caused from the Maasai Reserve and it had crossed the river. We have the 600 acres of land where Karen used to plant her coffee. The 1,000 acres of land where the natives used to build their huts and also their farms. Karen loved her natives to the point that she built a school for them. And so the natives were educated through the school that Karen built. We have dams that Karen had built because during that time water was uncertain, and so she built dams to provide water to her farm. It is now Waterfront Mall. model of the coffee drying machine that Karen used to dry her coffee. The original one had burnt down. Now, when the coffee beans were ready to be harvested, Karen would then send the women and the children who would harvest the coffee. Once they were harvested, they were washed to remove impurities. Now, after they were washed, they would then be placed into this pulping machine over here. Now, the pulping machine was used to separate the husks from the coffee beans, and once the husks were removed, water was then added to remove the excess sugar and also to flavor the coffee beans. Once the fermentation had taken place, they were then placed into the perforating drying chamber. Now, the perforating drying chamber was connected to the horizontal steam chamber, which was connected to a vertical steam boiler. The vertical steam boiler was separated into two parts. The lower one was used to keep firewood, while the upper one was used to keep water. So the firewood would boil the water to 100 degrees Celsius, and steam would be produced, and it would go to the horizontal steam chamber. The horizontal steam chamber was then connected to a pressure blower that was connected to the engine through a conveyor belt. Now, the engine was started by the tractor that we first saw, and once it was started, pressure would be produced and it would separate the hot air from water. Once it was separated, the blower would blow the hot air into the perforating drying chamber that was equipped with turbines that allowed it to spin for the equal distribution of hot air. This process took 24 hours. After it was done, the coffee beans were then packed into sacks, taken to Nairobi railway station, then to Mombasa, then shipped to London.